Hello my friends, welcome to another video at the Lulu Blue Studio. Today we're going to paint together some flowers from the flower color guide. In particular, we're going to paint this rhododendron, which is a beautiful pink flower, very fluffy, that we are going to paint in loose style. By the end of this video, you will be able to master this technique and apply it for other flower compositions. When I look at the reference, I understand that these flowers are very fluffy and I will be able to recreate this shape with a filbert brush. To follow the same color, I mix together some magenta and some scarlet lake. I press on the paper my filbert brush by using the belly and the tip of my brush. I drag basically the pigment to the internal part of the flower. I'm using a little bit of concentrated pigment, magenta, to create some darker areas with the wet in wet technique. I will allow the pigment to blend into the first layer where the petals are mainly created with a lot of water and less amount of pigment. Adding more pigment at a second stage will allow these flowers to seem more natural and more fluffy. I created this composition looking at my reference picture, therefore I'm creating a lot of flowers in the bottom part of the paper, and I will continue to create some bunches of flowers at the top. What I keep in mind to create this composition is to have different colors for these flowers. Some petals and some flowers are going to have a higher amount of pigment compared to water, therefore the flowers are going to be more concentrated and darker. Some other flowers are going to have a higher amount of water compared to pigment, and therefore they are going to seem a little bit lighter in color. I use the whole brush to create these flowers, always by pressing the brush onto paper, using the whole belly or maybe the side of the brush, and dragging all the petals to the same center. I will then remove some of the pigment into my cup of water in order to create some petals that are lighter in color. I can add then other strokes in a second moment through the wet on wet technique to allow these colors to blend together. For example, now I'm adding a little bit of scarlet lake and a little bit of magenta into the center part of these flowers that are still wet, and therefore I allow them to blend together. I'm always using the same technique to create these flowers, and I use the side of the brush and the whole belly of the brush to create different shapes of petals. I'm adding with the tip of the brush a little bit of accent colors through the wet in wet technique, always taking the scarlet lake and the magenta color to bleed into the base petals. The motions that I'm using with my brush are quite simple, and I just keep in mind to drag all the petals to the same center. Following my reference picture, I'm still creating some bunch of flowers in the center part, going towards the upper part of this piece of paper. I'm using a cold press paper, and this allows me to have beautiful wet in wet moments in these petals and overall in this whole composition. I keep using the brush, the filbert brush, and I keep moving my hand in order to use the belly of this brush, but also the side of this brush. The petals you will be able to achieve are very different in shape and will create some movement all over this composition. At this point, I've created flowers all over the paper, so I'm ready to start to create some leaves. To create leaves, I really prefer to use a mop brush because it gives me the opportunity to be very loose. Therefore, I'm taking a little bit of sap green, and with this mop brush, I'm just trying to create some round shapes starting from the bottom of the page. I remember to add into these leaves that are still wet some different colors in order to create variety in the composition. For example, I can add a little bit of yellow ochre, as I'm doing now, or I can add different types of greens, or I could create some darker leaves by adding a little bit of magenta into the sap green or a little bit of blue. To create these leaves, I'm using the belly of my mop brush. The belly is pretty big, and for this reason the leaves are going to be in round shape and quite big. When I'm using instead the tip of the brush, I'm able to create some very small leaves, some sort of points that give the impression of these leaves to be very, very small. It is very important to change the shape of these leaves beside the amount and the quantity of water and the ratio with the pigment in order to create a composition that is very diverse and natural. The greens that I have on my palette are of two types, permanent sap green and green earth. These colors are quite different. The permanent sap green is much brighter in color, and I mix them together to create different shades of greens. I also mix the green with some yellow, like yellow ochre or yellow lemon dip, in order to create a lighter sort of greens. By adding to the green a little bit of magenta color or red scarlet lake that we have used for the main flowers, we are going to close the gap between the brightness of the green, like sap green, and the red color that we have used for the flowers. The green we are going to obtain is going to be a little bit less bright and is going to fit very well into the whole composition because the flowers are exactly a mixture of magenta and scarlet lake. I like to start to create my leaves from lighter colors, and then I usually like to start to add darker leaves on top. Therefore, my first layer of leaves usually is in sap green color, and then I add some other leaves on top that are darker in colors. In this case, for example, I'm adding darker leaves that are a mixture of sap green and a little bit of magenta. When you create leaves, since this composition is very heavy in this element, remember to create them in different shapes, so you can use the whole brush in order to create different leaves that are going to create a beautiful composition full of movement and depth. I keep in mind in this composition to have some space where I will have branches in brown color that I'm going to create that are going to connect these flowers, because rhododendron have some branches that are connecting different bunches of flowers. I keep adding some darker strokes that imitate leaves. And usually to create darker greens, I like to mix the sap green with the blue. Usually I like to use Prussian blue or phthalo turquoise. I don't mind to go on top of leaves that I've already created with these darker strokes. I also love to add some violet, like ultramarine violet, to create a darker green that is different from the green that I can create adding just blue. I take a round brush in size 6 to create the branches that are connecting these bunches of flowers. They are not going to be super visible, but they are going to connect the main flowers, and I follow the bouquet that I have in front of me to check where these branches need to go. I just use the tip of my brush to create these very simple strokes, and the color I'm using is burnt umber. At this point, I look at my composition. I'm pretty happy with the results so far, but I think I can give some more details onto the flowers in order to let them pop. Therefore, I take my mop brush and some concentrated pigment, magenta, and I just create some strokes mainly in the center of these flowers and where some of the petals are ending. These strokes are just created with the tip of the brush and being very, very light on paper. I also like to add a little bit of Scarlet Lake onto these petals in order to create different colors and to give a more variety onto this composition. I'm adding these contrasting strokes while the first layer of pigment is already dry. Therefore, I'm using this wet on dry technique to add some elements. There isn't a specific rule on how to add these strokes. I just follow my imagination and I look at the reference picture to understand where there can be some areas that are darker in color. But mainly, I'm just allowing myself to play with everything I've just created. There is no right, no wrong. You can add these strokes if you'd like, but if you're happy without, that's also totally fine, and you can keep the composition as it is. This is the end of our tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed this.